In my last video, I discussed the recent Russian breakthrough towards Pokrovsk in the Donetsk Oblast, which is a major logistics hub for the Ukrainian armed forces. Today's video will not only be a further update, but I will also attempt to touch briefly across the entire front line and the several areas where the Russian army is currently advancing, particularly in Donetsk, Zaporizhia, and in Kharkiv. I'll also seek to reveal what seems to be the main Russian objective in the Porkrovsk offensive. All in all, the Ukrainian armed forces seem to be in a stage of collapse in Donetsk, and while they may be able to stem the Russian advances in some areas, the recent advance towards Porkrovsk seems to be the most alarming. It also seems now quite clear, more than ever, that the Ukrainian decision to divert some of its most elite forces from the Donbass area to counterattack against the Russian front in the north in Kharkiv was a bad idea and inevitably a trap. The result has been that decision has only served to weaken the Ukrainian defenses in Donetsk.
The other region is, although Russia is unlikely to be able to take Kharkiv, by attacking on a second front, it forces Ukraine, with its limited resources, to have to spread bet a little bit across the two, and that undoubtedly just makes life a little bit more difficult for Ukraine. Which
has always been Russia's main territorial goal. So let's get into today's video. So one of the best frontline assessments of recent has come from Medusa, which is an anti-Kremlin media website that has expressly condemned the Russian 2022 invasion. But despite its pro-Ukrainian slant, it still has proven to be one of the more accurate assessments in this war. They also do one of the most detailed counts of Russian casualties in conjunction with BBC Russian service, and as of July of this year, they can only confirm the names of 59,725 Russian soldiers who have been killed in this war from February 2022 to date. So they report that as of the 26th of July, the Russian army has made significant gains on the battlefield west of Avdiivka in eastern Ukraine. In spring, the Russian forces advanced several miles along the Avdiivka-Pokrovsk railway in a matter of days and captured the fortified village of Ocheretin. This was the first major breakthrough after the Russians captured Avdiivka in February. In mid-July, after some bloody fighting, Russian troops have achieved yet another breakthrough along the very same railway and captured the village of Porkrovsk, which I reported on in my previous video. This operation, says the article, has caused a string of what is described as acute crises for the Ukrainian armed forces in this sector. Further, the situation remains dire for the AFU in other areas of the front as well. Having captured the village of Novoselivka Pusha, Russian forces have nearly driven the AFU across the Vovcha River between Avdiivka and Pokrovsk, which is Ukraine's main logistical base in southern Donbass. The main thrust of Russia's attack, however, occurred north of the river's bend along the railroad running from Ocheretin towards Pokrovsk. Advancing Russian forces captured the village of Porkrovsk and its railway station. Russian forces outflanked the AFU to the north and south of Porkrovsk. Ukrainian sources even reported that several of its companies in the northern sector were surrounded. And with much palpable alarm, Medusa continues to report, and I quote, "If the AFU fails to stabilize the situation, Russian troops across a wide swath of the front may be able to reach the Pokrovsk-Konstantinivka highway, which is the main supply line to the AFU forces in Chasiv Yar and Toretsk. And they may do so in a matter of weeks." According to the Washington Post, Ukraine continues to suffer from a shortage of soldiers, and as election turmoil in the United States has set off new speculation that Kiev may soon be forced to negotiate a surrender of lands. The Russian army's advance on the villages around Toretsk has predictably slowed down after its initial success just about a month ago. The AFU command sent major reinforcements to Toretsk from other parts of the front, including Kupiansk and the Pokrovsk sector, which is likely contributed to Russia's breakthrough in Porkrovsk. In the villages of Pivdeny and Pivnichny, Russian troops have gotten bogged down in battles for control of areas full of high-rise buildings. Further north, the AFU's defense is embedded among mine waste dumps dozens of meters high, which also impedes Russia's advance. Russian forces have occupied the southern part of the village of New York, despite counterattacks by Ukraine's reserve forces. Further north, however, they will inevitably encounter resistance from Ukraine's forces at the phenol plant. Which should slow their advance. The Russian army has also made significant progress in the village of Zalizny, which neighbors New York. Russia's command is likely trying to surround or force out under threat of encirclement all of Ukraine's troops between Zalizny and New York. Russia's command could soon decide to launch attacks outside of the villages west of New York towards Konstantinivka so as to bypass Toretsk. Washington Post reported that a drone commander by the name of Serhiy said, in quotations, "The Russians are hitting New York with aviation bombs and artillery to completely obliterate entire quadrants of the city so that they can move troops in." Pasha, another drone commander, described the situation in New York as really hard. He said, in quotations, "They are using New York to encircle Toretsk, and I think they have a real chance now of encircling it. It's just a question of resources and timing." The glide bombs, he said, are so powerful that they can incapacitate entire infantry units with concussions. After the AFU transferred one of its most effective formations, the 95th Air Assault Brigade, from Kupiansk front to Toretsk in mid-July, the situation in the eastern part of the Kharkiv region worsened for Ukraine. Russian troops advanced several kilometers to the west and captured the village of Pishany, or at least most of it, about 10 kilometers or 6.2 miles from the Oskil River in the mid to late July. The AFU has supply lines along the river across a wide front from Liman to Kupiansk. Most of the bridges across the Oskil have been destroyed, and the river crossings built by the Ukrainian army are constantly under attack. If Russia reaches the river, it could make it harder for Ukraine to defend Kupiansk and the area encompassing the Kremina forest and Liman. Despite the hype from pro-Ukrainian sources, the truth is Ukraine's counteroffensive to the north of Kharkiv has so far failed to produce results, the article reads. The AFU's attempt to cut off the Russian group's west flank and later push it to across the Russian border by taking control of the village of Haiblok was unsuccessful. The Russian army transferred reserves to the area and pushed the AFU out of the agricultural buildings where they were stationed on the northern outskirts of Haiblok. In Vovchansk, the Russian army resumed its offensive in the town's high-rise residential area, which had been interrupted by Ukrainian counterattacks in the eastern and central parts of the town. According to the Washington Post, while the Russian reinvasion of Kharkiv, as they call it, yielded limited gains, it nonetheless diverted Ukrainian resources. Alexander, a 30-year-old battalion commander of the 47th Brigade fighting near Osheretyn, said that Ukrainian forces are struggling and that, and I quote, Putin's prize increasingly seems within Russia's reach. He continues to say that the Russian strategy is clever. You try to concentrate the strength of your enemy in one direction and then distract them at another, said Alexander, whose call sign is Genius. The first objective is to destroy us. In other words, as I have repeatedly said, and as President Putin said in his February 2022 speech, to demilitarize the Ukrainian army. And then he says, the second is to push us so they can get more leverage for peace talks and get more from us. They are almost capturing the Donetsk region, he said. So as I said in my previous videos, you are now hearing it directly from a Ukrainian commander's mouth on the front line, in addition to a Ukrainian journalist from my previous video. Russia's primary aim is firstly and foremostly to demilitarize the Ukrainian army and secondarily to push as far as they can territorially in anticipation of negotiations toward the November elections in the USA or the end of the year. 1 week ago, Russian troops unexpectedly advanced several kilometers and reached the Volhyda-Konstantinivka highway in southern Donbass. This is the main supply line for Ukraine's Volhyda grouping, which has held the area since March of 2022, despite several powerful offenses by the Russian army. A Russian blockade of this main road won't, however, accelerate the fall of Volhyda, as Ukraine has backup supply lines to the west of the city, but it will make the situation significantly worse for Ukraine. Russian forces are now dangerously close to the Pivdeno Donbaska 1 coal mine, which has served as an important fortified area for the AFU on the Volhyda front. But aside from the Russian initiative on several fronts across the front line in Donetsk and eastern Ukraine, more and more of the Ukrainian soldiers are commenting about the dire internal situation of the army. Take for instance this quote from a sergeant identified by his call sign Bart to the Washington Post. He said, "The situation is critical. There was serious chaos on the front lines." He blamed failures in leadership decisions, including cases of, and get this, Ukrainian and Russian forces mixing up their positions. And lastly, according to Russia Matters, Joe Biden's decision to drop out of the presidential race and support his VP Kamala Harris has Russian influentials divided on whether a Democrat can defeat the GOP's Donald Trump in November. Boris Mezhev, a Moscow-based political scientist, told pro-Kremlin media in reference to Harris, "I think her prospects can be described as positive. The gap in ratings with Donald Trump is only a few percent." According to Russian foreign policy veteran Senator Alexei Pushkov, however, in the battle for presidency, Trump defeated Biden ahead of schedule. Pushkov's colleague and deputy chairman of the Russian Senate, Konstantin Kosachev, also believes Trump is more likely to win. In contrast, Putin's spokesman, Dmitry Peskov, said that nothing good can be expected when he was asked what the Kremlin expects from the US presidential elections.